In the summer of 1794, the man who once held the fate of thousands in his hands would finally fall victim to the same blade he had used so relentlessly. Maximilien Robespierre. Known across France as the Incorruptible, Robespierre had become both the face of revolutionary justice and the symbol of its darkest extremes. His name alone inspired fear, from the grand halls of nobility to the cramped alleys of the common folk. Under his watch, the guillotine wasn't just an execution device. It was the ultimate weapon of political control. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The same guillotine that had claimed kings, queens, and revolutionaries alike was now being sharpened for its most famous champion. This isn't just the story of a man's execution. It's the story of how the mastermind behind the Reign of Terror ended up as one of its final and most symbolic casualties. As he approached the scaffold, his jaw shattered by a failed suicide or botched arrest. He couldn't even speak a final word. July 28, 1794, didn't just mark Robespierre's end. It signaled the collapse of a terrifying chapter in the French Revolution, a time when justice and vengeance were nearly impossible to tell apart. To really understand the tragedy and the poetic justice of Robespierre's downfall, we have to go back. We need to follow the arc of how an idealistic small-town lawyer from Arras became the most feared man in France. The French Revolution ignited in 1789 amid a storm of economic disaster, outrageous inequality, and widespread corruption. The monarchy under King Louis XVI was bankrupt, and the people, especially peasants and the urban poor, were starving. The centuries-old feudal system was crumbling, and with it, the traditional social hierarchy. Into this chaos stepped a 30-year-old lawyer, Maximilien Robespierre. At first, he was a passionate defender of the downtrodden, someone who believed in rights, justice, and moral virtue. But as the revolution progressed, he evolved, some might say mutated, into something much darker. The revolution didn't move in a straight line. It surged in waves, each more radical than the last. What began with the demand for a constitutional monarchy quickly escalated into calls for a republic, then descended into blood-soaked purges of so-called enemies of the state. By 1793, France was at war on multiple fronts, against Austria, Prussia, Britain, and other monarchies. Inside its borders, rebellion simmered. The revolution was in crisis, and fear was everywhere. That's when Robespierre and his political allies, through the Committee of Public Safety, declared that terror was not only acceptable, it was necessary. Under Robespierre's leadership, the guillotine became a centerpiece of political life. And the philosophy behind this reign of bloodshed? It was rooted in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, especially the idea of the general will. Robespierre believed the revolution had a moral duty to protect virtue by destroying corruption, and that anyone standing in the way of that transformation was expendable. To Robespierre, executing an enemy wasn't personal, it was a moral imperative. The guillotine, invented by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin as a supposedly humane alternative to older, more painful methods of execution, became the symbol of this new revolutionary justice. Before, social class often determined how a person died, but the guillotine promised equality, even in death. Swift, efficient, and terrifying, it became known as the national razor. Under Robespierre's guidance, that blade got a serious workout. Between September 1793 and July 1794, France entered the most infamous period of the Revolution, the Reign of Terror. In those 10 months, revolutionary courts sentenced around 17,000 people to death. Every morning in Paris, crowds gathered to watch executions as if they were public entertainment. Heads rolled into baskets, and people cheered. Justice had transformed into spectacle, and it wasn't just royalists or aristocrats who faced the blade. Anyone could be accused of crimes against the revolution. Your neighbor, your friend, even your child. In fact, Robespierre's government passed a law in September 1793 called the Law of Suspects, which made it ridiculously easy to arrest someone for virtually anything. A rumor, a look, a poorly timed comment. People denounced each other out of fear or revenge. Children reported their parents. Former allies turned on one another. The paranoia was crushing. Meanwhile, life outside the courtroom wasn't getting any better. The revolution had promised bread and justice, but most people still couldn't afford food. Inflation had destroyed the value of France's paper currency, the assignat, and fights over resources were constant. In that environment, the guillotine became a kind of pressure valve. When people were hungry or angry, the execution of a few traitors gave them someone to blame. Things were just as grim on the international stage. France was at war with half of Europe, and every battlefield loss became an excuse to look for traitors at home. Robespierre argued that France could only survive if it purged itself of all internal threats, whether real or imagined. By early 1794, many of the revolution's original goals had already been met. The king had been executed, the monarchy abolished, and feudalism dismantled. France was now a republic. But Robespierre didn't slow down. If anything, he doubled down. He was convinced the revolution was still in danger, and he pushed for even more executions. The guillotine wasn't just a punishment. It was a purifying force. Robespierre wasn't out in the streets pulling levers on the guillotine. But make no mistake, he was its master. His brand of terror wasn't random. It was methodical, organized, and disturbingly calm. He worked from his modest apartment on the Rue Saint-Honoré, surrounded by stacks of reports, accusations, and death warrants. Each morning, he reviewed the latest lists of suspects sent in by local committees and informants. His handwriting was clean, neat, deliberate. Hundreds of people were sent to die with the same level of care one might use to send formal invitations. The machinery of death was fine-tuned. Revolutionary tribunals, restructured under Robespierre's influence, delivered rapid-fire verdicts, sometimes in minutes. Trials didn't really determine guilt or innocence anymore. They were just the final step in a predetermined process. Defense attorneys were dismissed as irrelevant. There were only two possible outcomes: acquittal or death. And acquittals? Those were becoming rare. Robespierre's speeches in the National Convention were legendary, fiery, idealistic, and chilling. He'd rise at the podium, his pale face and powdered hair striking under the flickering candlelight, and he'd launch into fierce tirades about virtue, justice, and the enemies lurking in the shadows. He didn't just argue for executions, he elevated them into moral acts. Each beheading was, in his words, a sacrifice to protect the future of liberty. Even though he didn't attend the executions himself, his fingerprints were on every stage of the process. Prisoners were loaded into wooden carts, paraded through the streets, and brought to the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine stood tall, painted blood red, with executioner Charles-Henri Sanson operating like a machine. Dozens could die in a single day. Robespierre didn't need to be there. His system ran on its own. His legacy was in the routine, the mechanical efficiency of death, the crowds watching in silence or celebration, the heads displayed like trophies. And worst of all, the fear worked. It bled into every home, every conversation. People stopped talking in public. They monitored their thoughts. Just hearing Robespierre's name could send a chill through a room. His surveillance network was everywhere. Local committees, spies, informants, and ordinary citizens feeding the machine. Even children weren't safe. Skilled artisans and merchants had either fled, been executed, or simply stopped working out of fear. Markets were empty. The assignat, the revolutionary currency, was almost worthless. The chaos left behind in the wake of Robespierre's reign wasn't just political. It was economic and psychological, scarring the soul of the nation. But how did the man once hailed as the incorruptible become the most feared figure in France? It began subtly. Robespierre's speeches became more cryptic, more paranoid. His circle of trusted allies shrank. He increasingly spoke in abstract terms, virtue, corruption, justice, yet refused to name names. And in a climate like revolutionary France, not naming names was terrifying. Because if you didn't know who the next target was, it could be you. By mid-1794, even Robespierre's fellow revolutionaries were growing wary. The National Convention, once a platform for fiery unity, turned tense. People whispered that Robespierre was planning a purge within the government itself, and when he introduced a new law, the Law of 22 Prairial, it confirmed their worst fears. This law was a turning point. It eliminated even the pretense of justice. Trials no longer required evidence. There was no need for defense or witnesses. The accused could be executed simply for being enemies of the people. That was all. No explanation required. No appeal. And suddenly, even Robespierre's friends began to imagine the guillotine in their own futures. Within weeks of the law's passing, the death toll surged again. The prisons filled to bursting. Executions became so frequent that the stench of blood and decay clung to the streets of Paris. The terror was now indiscriminate. No one was safe. Not nobles, not peasants, not even those who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Robespierre at the revolution's start. Among those who began to distance themselves was Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, known as the Angel of Death. Young, idealistic, and fiercely loyal to Robespierre, even Saint-Just began to sense that the tide was turning. But he remained by Robespierre's side until the very end. The breaking point came on the 8th of Thermidor, July 26, 1794. Robespierre stood before the National Convention and delivered a vague, threatening speech. He railed against corruption. He warned of conspiracies. He declared that enemies of the revolution were among them, but he refused to say who. The room grew tense. Faces turned pale. Deputies who had once cheered his fiery words now stared back in silence, uncertain whether they were the accused or the accuser. It was a mistake, a fatal one. That night, a coalition of frightened revolutionaries, those who believed they might be next, met in secret. They decided Robespierre had to be stopped, immediately. The next morning, July 27th, Robespierre entered the convention again. But this time, he was interrupted. Deputies shouted him down. They accused him of tyranny. When he tried to speak, he was drowned out by cries of "Down with the tyrant." The convention voted to arrest him. What followed was chaos. Robespierre, Saint-Just, and a handful of loyalists fled to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall of Paris. There, they hoped the National Guard would rally to their defense. But the city was exhausted. Parisians were tired of executions, tired of fear, tired of blood. No one came. At 2 a.m. on July 28th, government forces stormed the Hôtel de Ville. In the confusion, Robespierre either attempted suicide or was shot in the jaw, No one knows for certain. What's clear is that when they found him, he was slumped in a chair, his face shattered, blood soaking through a handkerchief pressed to his lower jaw. He was still alive. Barely. Dragged back to the conciergerie, the very prison where so many of his victims had waited for death, Robespierre now waited too. But he would not be given the luxury of words. His broken jaw meant he couldn't speak. The man whose voice had once swayed a nation now sat silent, drooling blood. That afternoon, Robespierre and 21 of his allies were taken to the guillotine. Among them, Saint-Just, Couthon, Lebas. They were loaded into carts and paraded through the streets of Paris. This time the crowd was silent. No cheering, no jeering, just quiet, stunned faces. At 6:15 p.m., Maximilien Robespierre, age 36, was executed. The executioner ripped the bloodied bandage from his jaw, prompting a scream that one witness called the scream of a soul falling into hell. And with that, the blade fell. The reign of terror was over. The impact of Robespierre's death was immediate and dramatic. His closest allies were hunted down or fled. The law of 22nd Prairial was repealed. The Revolutionary Tribunal was stripped of its power. Within days, the prisons began to empty. The daily executions ceased. For the first time in over a year, Parisians began to breathe freely, but the scars remained. Tens of thousands had been imprisoned, at least 17,000 executed by guillotine, and many more died in prisons or massacres. France had become a nation afraid of itself, turning on its own with terrifying speed. And yet, in the eyes of some, Robespierre remained a martyr, a man who had tried to build a new world and had been destroyed by those unwilling to follow through. For others, he was a monster, a fanatic whose obsession with virtue became justification for atrocity. His legacy remains deeply polarizing. To his supporters, Robespierre was the only one who truly believed in the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. To his enemies, he was the embodiment of hypocrisy, a man who preached justice while authorizing mass murder. But one thing is clear: the French Revolution, which had begun as a movement for freedom, ended, at least for a time, in tyranny and blood. And no figure represents that transformation more completely than Maximilien Robespierre. The guillotine that had silenced kings and queens, rebels and writers, priests and peasants, finally turned on the man who gave it its power. And as it fell, it didn't just end a life. It ended a chapter in human history, a chapter where ideals became weapons, and the search for justice became indistinguishable from vengeance. But perhaps the most haunting question is this: could it have ended any other way? Robespierre was not the first idealist to believe in a better world, nor the last to justify violence as a necessary path to it. Across history, revolutions often devour their children. Power, once seized in the name of justice, has a way of slipping into tyranny. The guillotine was supposed to be a symbol of equality. All would die the same, king or commoner. But in the end, it became a conveyor belt of paranoia and silence. And behind it all was a man who saw himself not as a dictator, but as a prophet of virtue. He genuinely believed that without terror, virtue was powerless, that in order to save the revolution, he had to purify it, no matter the cost. But what is virtue if it leads to fear? What is justice if it requires the silence of the grave? And what kind of freedom thrives only when drenched in blood? These questions echoed long after Robespierre's fall. They echo still. In modern democracies, we often assume that tyranny wears a crown or carries a scepter. But in Robespierre's France, tyranny wore a sash, held a pamphlet, and spoke the language of morality. It quoted Rousseau. It wept for the poor. It vowed to save the people and then condemned them to die. Robespierre's story is a cautionary tale, not of monsters rising to power, but of men who believed they were good. And perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all, because evil that knows it is evil can be resisted, but evil that believes it is righteous, that's far harder to stop. As the blade fell for the last time on 22nd Thermidor, the crowd looked on, not with joy, but with exhaustion. The terror had burned itself out. France would stagger forward into a new phase, eventually into empire under Napoleon, and then into more cycles of revolution and change. But that moment, the death of Robespierre, marked the end of an era where ideals, untethered from compassion, became instruments of death, where the quest for purity led not to enlightenment, but to silence. And so, the man once called the incorruptible left behind a legacy that is anything but clean. His face, shattered by a bullet, remains a fitting symbol. The mouth that once inspired a nation, silenced by his own fall. We remember Robespierre not just because he rose and fell, but because he reminds us what happens when we forget that justice without mercy is no justice at all. Thank you for watching. If you found this story powerful, consider subscribing to Echoes of Torture, where we don't just tell the past, we uncover its shadows.